Well, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when and where you are in this world today watching this webinar. Happy to have you guys here. I do want to let you know that this 101 training is going to be a little bit different. Some of the slides that I'm showing here were thrown on me recently, and so we're going to go through this as we're going to go through this together and learn as we both go. Before we get started on this, I always like to go over a couple of basic topics here. One is that this webinar is live. We have a team here that is ready to answer your questions as you have them. Feel free to use this GoToWebinar control panel. Type your questions there on the right, and our team is pretty responsive. If you feel like you have more technical questions or maybe still not understanding something, by all means, reach out to support@domotz.com and we will get to those. I, of course, invite Giancarlo, our CTO, to interrupt me at any time if there is a question that comes up that is pertinent to the topic, or maybe I addressed something in a way that was confusing. I want him to interrupt us so that can happen. Let's see. Agenda. So this is what our 101 typically looks like. Right? We'll talk about what Domotz is, how it works. We get a lot of basic questions around that. We'll get into some of the aspects of account management and licensing, as well as what it means to activate an agent. And then we'll dive into some of the basic features that you'll use for Domotz. A lot of these are kind of around just the fundamentals, right? How we do network topology, how we remotely connect to devices, dealing with configuration management of the network infrastructure. Also, we'll look at some of the different capabilities around workstations and servers, because we get a lot of questions on that. And then some of the more advanced features with respect to security cameras, what we do there, and SNMP monitoring or TCP monitoring in general. Lastly, we'll talk about setting up alerts as well. And then we'll try to get into a little bit of an overview of what we'll do in the 201 webinar, where we'll start talking about more advanced things. With that being said, let's talk a little bit more about how Domotz gets utilized by service providers in general. First of all, when you think of Domotz, we fundamentally are a network monitoring and management solution, but we have a lot of people using us for the asset management side of Domotz. So one of the things that we do extremely well is we discover all of the devices. So anything that has a MAC address that is on your networks, we will discover that. But more importantly, we're going to actually classify those devices by the manufacturer or the make, the model of that device and the type as best as we can, given the system that's there. This is going to be really, really useful for you when it comes to documentation. I'll also point out, for those of you that are starting to deal with security and you're dealing with security frameworks, CIS control number 1 is based around understanding everything that is on your network, not just the endpoints that you're monitoring, right? Not just those laptops, PCs, servers, right? It's everything, all the AV equipment, all the IoT devices, all the embedded systems. And Domotz does a really good job of classifying those devices and helping you document those. And you'll see in the 201 class how we can integrate a lot of that information into your documentation tools as well, which makes it just easier and more efficient for you. The second thing, and again, probably our core value, is really understanding what does the network itself look like? How do I manage that network? How can I diagnose when there are problems on the network? We're going to dive into a lot of that with respect to Domotz, but regardless of which network infrastructure products you use, whether they're certain brands of firewalls, certain brands of managed switches, other brands of wireless access points, we're going to be able to put those into a common or consistent UI, so you have a nice pane of glass for understanding what's going on inside the network. We're going to help you with downloading configuration files, and we'll show you an example of that. But lastly, the way in which service providers use us is really around security and awareness. I mentioned these CIS controls and how asset management is CIS control 1. Network management is really CIS control number 12. Security and awareness is about all of the 18 controls within the version 8 of the CIS security controls. So the One thing that Domotz does really well is looking at devices, being able to look at ports that are on each device for either management or vulnerability purposes. We look at when new devices get discovered on the network, and we're doing this very actively, right? We're monitoring your networks 24/7. When a device shows up on the network, within 30 seconds, you're going to get a notification that a new device is on that particular LAN, and we're going to tell you what it is and where it's connected. So this is some important parts of what Domotz does, really helping you across the board run your business more efficiently. That being said, how does it work? Well, Domotz fundamentally is a cloud-based service. We have multiple clouds throughout the world. We do that so that way we can cover the various privacy laws that are out there, whether it's GDPR in Europe or some of the new laws in California, right, in North America. Right? We have these different clouds, these different data centers where your data is encrypted and stored appropriately. It is that cloud where all of the intelligence is within Domotz. The cloud communicates with what we call an agent. You can think of this as a collector as well, or a probe. That agent sits on the local area network. The great thing about the agent is it's extremely flexible. We have versions for Windows, Linux, embedded systems like Raspberry Pis if you want to do that. If you have NAS drives like Synology or QNAP, you can find the Domotz agent inside their stores. You can put it on virtual machines as well. So if you want to just spin this up on a server that you have running and create your own VM with an instance of Domotz, you can do that. We also have available on places like Amazon or through some of our partners, you'll find this black box. So on Amazon, you can find it for 129 US dollars or 129 euros, depending on where you are. But that box essentially is running a version of Ubuntu Core OS, which allows us to not only update the application like we do with all of our agents, but we also can update the kernel, keeping it as safe as possible. It is that agent that communicates with the cloud. It's the cloud that is telling the agent when to scan the network, but when something changes on that network, that agent is communicating back to the cloud, so that way the cloud can then alert you in an appropriate way. The way in which you get alerted is through either the web apps, through the desktop apps, through mobile applications. So we have, this is something that very few people recognize, but we do have mobile apps, so available on iOS and Android. Of course, it is that front end or that application that is giving you visibility into all the information about not only a single network, but also multiple networks. Because we're a cloud-based system, it allows us to be very multi-tenant, giving us visibility into tens or even hundreds or thousands of agents at any one point in time. The agent itself is communicating with everything that's on the network as much as possible. When you first deploy an agent, you're going to what we call activate that agent by inserting your username and password into that agent. Once you do that, it associates the agent with the cloud in a secure manner, but then the agent will start to scan that network. We do layer 2 scans. We're looking for all the MAC addresses that are associated with the network, and then we are enriching that data as I talked about before. When we discover things like switches or workstations or wireless systems, we will start to interrogate those systems further. Now, for those of you that are more advanced, you know that probably leveraging SNMP, you've changed the community strings. You possibly and hopefully have changed the default passwords. You do need to provide Domotz with that information, but it's very easy to do that, especially with respect to SNMP, being able to apply that community string for your whole network one time, and it will start looking across all of these infrastructure devices. We're going to show in the demo, once we have some of these details, like the things that you can start to see, especially within the network infrastructure, you know, where devices are connected, how much power is being consumed by PoE devices. On workstations, we're going to look at the operating system. We're going to look at the physical memory. We're going to look at the logical disk space. If there are any virtual machines that are spun up, we can show you information like that as well. When it comes to UPSs and power distribution units, we'll scan those. We'll give you the ability to power cycle outlets. Will give you the ability to see how much battery or runtime is left within a UPS. On printers, we're going to show you ink levels within printers, or toner levels, right? How much the drum kits time is remaining, or how much percentage of usage is there. So there's a lot of power that you're going to see within Domotz once you very quickly activate that. This gets into a little bit more information about how the discovery itself works. At a layer 2 level, we do what's called ARP requests or ARP scans, looking for all the MAC addresses that are associated with the systems. We'll even go up to layer 3, looking at the IP addresses, and then of course we go beyond that at the application layers within the OSI model for networking. Essentially, we're looking for anything like ZeroConf, Bonjour, SNMP, UPnP, anything that has to do with network scans or network protocols. And I'm going to say well-established generic network protocols. We're going to try to extract that information from every single device in order to enrich the information associated with those devices. We often get asked about the types of networks that Domotz can support. By default, a Domotz agent will scan a /22 CIDR or network mask, giving you visibility into 1,024 devices. But we do have the ability to configure the agent for /16. That is something that we do within our enterprise packages within Domotz. And if you want more information about that, please reach out to support@domotz.com or reach out to our sales team, which is sales@domotz.com. When we start scanning the networks, we're going to scan the networks that we are attached to, meaning that where we have layer 2 visibility. So for those of you that are familiar with setting up networks, right, a VLAN means that you know, the network interface card that the agent is associated with has visibility through VLAN tags, or it's being managed within the switch at a layer 2 level. We can set up Domotz to look across subnets. Okay, so if there is a routed subnet within the local area network where we're looking at IP addresses, right, where we can't do ARP scans because those are blocked, but we can look across the IP address level and look into subnets, we can scan those. And another thing that you'll see within the demo that we get to is that Domotz does have the ability to look at external IPs as well, or host names. So if you want to ping, you know, google.com or some other server that's out there, you can do that as well. Okay, so all of this boils down to Domotz being a tool for you, right? As a service provider, we're helping you improve your operational efficiency. We're also helping you with proactive monitoring. We're helping you fulfill the SLAs that you are associated with in your business. Account management. I want to talk about account management. You guys have already set up, most likely, have set up an account. You created yourself as a team master when you first created the free trial within Domotz. That username that you used to create the account became the team master, which gives you the ability to manage your team. You can add team members, you can add field operators. The difference between a team member and a team master is really that of billing. The team master is the one that can insert the credit card and deal with payments and invoicing within the system. They are also the ones who can, the team master is the one who can add those team members, whereas a team member cannot. Team members do have the ability to view all of the agents that are associated with your network, and field operators have the ability to only manage the agents that they have visibility given to them by a team member. Field operators can also manage the agents that they add themselves. So both team members and field operators can add agents, but I will say that a field operator is typically used if you want to minimize risk associated with your company. For larger organizations, you may use field operators for very exact visibility on certain clients. And in some cases, we do see service providers giving their customers end access to the agents that are monitoring their own sites. But as we said, Domotz is really meant to be a tool for you as a service provider to help you be more efficient, help you fulfill those SLAs. So, it's not often that you see customers gaining access to the Domotz environment through a field operator. Okay. Oh, it says on this tip at the very bottom, don't forget to enable 2FA. Of course, right? Multi-factor authentication is extremely important, and we'll talk about that here in the demo. So we wanted to address licensing because that's a question that always comes up, and I want to make sure you're aware of this. So the Domotz agent is $21, 21 euros, 21 pounds, right, per month, per network that you are monitoring. That is essentially per site. So when you deploy an agent, right, or you put that collector or that probe in an environment and you associate to that to your account, you will be charged that $21 per month. The other thing that I want to point out, because this always stumps people, billing doesn't start, your billing cycle doesn't start until the last day of your trial, essentially that 15th day, right, after you started your trial. At which point, depending on the number of agents that you have activated, you will be billed for those starting in that month. We bill going forward. So if you have an account or an agent that's active on the day of your billing cycle, you will be billed for it. If you activate an agent within the billing cycle, you will be billed for that month in full. There's no, just so you're aware of this, there are no prorating that happens within the billing cycle. So you'll be billed in full, and then at the start of that next month, you'll be billed the next month going forward on that new agent. So just keep those things in mind. We get a lot of questions by that, but it's pretty clear as you look at your invoice how those things look. All right, we covered account management, we covered licensing, which are two of the things that are less fun. Let's go into the demo itself. When you first activate your agent and you've entered your username and password, right, the thing that you're going to start to see here, the very first thing you're going to go into is what we call this Sites Explorer page. This is where you will see all of the sites in this column, the agents that you have monitoring your networks. Okay, on this page, you're going to also see a map where you can then dive into the locations. One of the things we get asked often is that this particular agent, right, may not be in the location that you expect. We use the internet service providers to and their geolocation information to understand where agents should be. But if you want to be very exact on a particular agent, you need to go into the agent and customer configuration section, and under customer you can set in the specific address where you set the agent location here. Okay, so that is how you will get an exact site on that map. A few things that I want to show with respect to Domotz before we get into a lot of the details. So a couple things. We go into an agent, we get out of the Sites Explorer, we go into the dashboard of the agent itself. As mentioned, the very first thing that Domotz did when you activated it is it started scanning the network. It started trying to associate all of the devices that are on that network by MAC address and into make, model, and type, okay? As we look at each system that's out there, when we dive into, this is a security camera, you'll see under the info tab at the bottom, we'll pull out the MAC address, we'll pull out the IP address, and as I mentioned, we'll look for whatever application layer protocols are being broadcasted by that system. We'll also look for which ports, or what we call TCP services, are being enabled on these devices. At this point, we're looking for common services, things like SNMP, HTTP, SSH, Telnet, things that are being used for management. The reason we do that is so that we can remotely connect into those devices and manage them as appropriate. When we look at network infrastructure devices, okay, we start to interrogate those things further. The reason we do that is because we want to not only see, which ports are available for managing the network switches, the firewalls, the access points, but we also want to look for things like SNMP. okay, which allows a simple network management protocol. The way you ensure that you have the right credentials or authentication community strings is that you can come under the Access Manager tab. You can edit these. You can set it to be whatever it needs to be. And then you can apply that across all of the devices in this network if you want. I just use the standard V2 public-private community strings here to look at this. If you have systems that we discover that have SSH capabilities or deeper management capabilities, we also give you the ability, you can unlock those, I should say. You'll see things like servers that may have Windows running on it where we want to manage it through WinRM. You may have SSH on Linux-based systems that allows us to interrogate those systems further. Once we've entered those credentials, once we have unlocked these devices, we then can start to look in depth at these devices. We can start to see all the interfaces that are associated with these devices. We can interrogate each port. We can look for how much power is being consumed. Here you can see these first 5 ports are associated with security cameras. We can see, we can power cycle these ports. We can look at bandwidth across these ports. We can look for just general information about it itself and what systems are connected to these. We can look for errors and packets being discarded within the system as well. So very, very powerful ways in which you can start to utilize this network infrastructure for diagnosing problems on the network as well. Let's go back to this lab. Let's look for this point. I think we have a printer here that we can look at. So, oops, this one's locked. And you know what? Let's not look at this because I remember I changed it from wired to wireless. Let's go back to this office. And while we're pulling this information up, I think if we look at this brother printer that's on here, which is unlocked, we can see under SNMP lots of information about things like the toner usage, the belt consumption, right? Things that we may care about. This is just an example of what you can do with SNMP. I'll point out as well, if we go to the inventory tab and under devices, if we look at things like Geist, this is a temperature humidity sensor, right? When we're starting to look at SNMP, and we'll talk about how we set these things up here later, but we can look at, you know, average temperature over time. We can look at dew points. And by the way, we can set all these alerts. So this is just something I wanted to show you on this. The last thing that I want to show just for an understanding, so you have an understanding, is let's look up Cisco and let's go to a model here of SG350. We'll look at this Draper office. One of the things that you can do within the managed switch environments is you can start to look at configurations and see how they have been backed up. Okay, so this is the current configuration that's running, but if I wanted to compare that to an old one and see what's changed, I can do that. I can set alerts on these things as well. So just keep this in mind as we start to go through all of these setups and details within Domotz. Okay, so those are just some examples of things that can get done and how it works. Let's dive into the details of, we want to go looking through my notes here. I want to talk about some of the team management stuff that we showed or we talked about briefly. Under your account on the left-hand side, you can go into the team management area. When you open this up, it will open to a page. By the way, you can get here also by going to portal.domotz.com. You'll notice that you can add team members or add people as a team member or a field operator. One thing that's in Domotz that you need to be aware of is that we leverage email addresses as the unique identifiers for people within Domotz. So you cannot reuse emails. There can only be one email associated throughout all of the Domotz databases. You can insert the name, the email of this person. Highly recommend that you take advantage of multi-factor authentication as we talked about before, but then you can assign this person or this user to be able to access all your agents or not. Okay. Here you can see different examples of where I have users in here. If you want to add agents by which they can see or not, you can easily do that here. You can remove agents as appropriate as well from those users. Let's cancel this. You'll note on this team management page that this is where you can start to see who is taking advantage of 2FA or is not, right? And if they've set it up, okay? So here you can see Lorenzo has set up 2FA, good job, Lorenzo, where others have not taken advantage of that in this example. This is important for you as a manager or in your company, that if you're following security frameworks, you're following security processes, this is a way for you to check how people are using that. That being said, how do you set up 2FA? Well, if you come over here to your account page, you'll notice that you have a two-factor authentication tab in the middle of this page. When you click on this, this is where you can enable it by inserting your password. You'll then get the QR code that you can scan into your 2FA tool, you know, whether you use something like LastPass or Duo or whatever it may be, Google Authenticator. You do have the ability for larger enterprises that are taking advantage of SAML or single sign-on type services. You can use these as well. These are SAML 2.0 based services. If there's a particular identity provider that you are using that you don't see listed here, by all means reach out to our support team and we can help get this associated with your system or services. Okay. Single sign-on is a beautiful way to leverage an identity management tool that you guys are using and just keep all your users or your team members in tune with that, such that if you need to make changes in your environment, you can make it at one time. Two-factor authentication and SSO, as far as I'm concerned, are a must for you guys. So please, please take advantage of that because security should be a priority for you. Okay, let's get away from the team management stuff. Let's get back into the sites. Let's talk a little bit about the network infrastructure and how we start setting this up. At a base level, as we said, the Domotz agent itself is going to scan the network that it is attached to or associated with, right? That VLAN, that virtual LAN that it's on, and looking at a layer 2 level. If you need information about configuring a VLAN, you can come on the right-hand side of the devices page and click on Configure VLAN. There'll be information into how to set that up. Essentially, you're going into port 3000 of the agent's IP address. But if you are dealing with a server or a virtual machine, you may have to go in and configure the network interface card or that bridge tool that's in there in order to make that work properly. And one other thing I want to say about VLANs, most of you should know this, but you also need to make sure that the managed switch is set up to tag the appropriate VLANs or use a trunk port as appropriate towards that agent. If you want to set up layer 3 scans, IP address or subnet scans, which will provide Domotz with IP addresses of devices, you can do that here. On the right-hand side of that devices page, again over here, you'll see configure private subnet scan. This is where you can add IP addresses and the appropriate CIDRs for these ranges. Here you can see I just configured a modem, which is right outside the local area network, to see the status of that device. If you want to utilize subnets for things like security VLANs or point of sale systems, right, you can do that and still remain within the compliance of those particular systems. So that's just a feature that you have there. The other thing that you should be aware of is these external hosts. So here you can see I've configured things like Google DNS, Cloudflare, right, BlueJeans. Great examples. BlueJeans, I think, is a great example because it allows you to look at things like your unified communication systems, your voice over IP systems, things that are cloud hosted, to see how they are behaving. When you set up a external host, we're going to do all the same things that we can do as an agent within the LAN. We're going to do round trip delay testing, right? Pinging of this device to see if it's online. We're going to look for areas at which we lose packets or where the system goes offline in our mind. We can set up alerts on these systems as well. So for any device that's on the network, any device that's on a subnet, okay, any external host, you're going to be able to do things like pinging and setting alerts on these and doing network diagnostics. This is a great way to look at an external service from the point of view of the agent that is on that network, because it is the agent that is doing this pinging. It's not the cloud, it's not the Domotz cloud service, it's the agent. So it's really going through that local area network of your customers, and it's pinging out to that service. So that's an important detail that's there. Within the devices, okay, so this is how we set up, right, the networks that we can scan, whether they are attached or routed or external. When we get into each device itself, you notice that there's a lot of information within these devices, and there's a lot of devices that, for instance, I don't have associated with a particular area. If I want to click on a device, I can come into this device. We'll see the information at the networking level that is associated with this device. But if I want to go in and change the name to be a more user-friendly name, I can do that. For instance, I know that this particular NIC within this touchscreen is a wireless connection, so I called it as such. Okay, the make, right, or the manufacturer who made that, we're going to do our best to discover who it is. But sometimes devices will use cards that are associated with a third party and not necessarily the manufacturer, and you may want to change that. So you can edit that here. You can even edit the model if the model number doesn't show up appropriately. One of the things that we like to do, and this really depends on the process by which you use for your documentation, right, and your team, is you can add location and zone information. This all depends on the customer, the setup, right, whether you're an enterprise and you're dealing with buildings or whether you're dealing with floors. In this case, I put zones based on floors and locations based on rooms, but this is up to you how you handle all of that. You can also set up the type of device. So in this case, we assumed it's a touch panel, right, that goes on the wall. But in the case of a security camera or whatever it is, or if you want to describe this as something different, you have a plethora of choices to take here. Last thing I want to say, and I mentioned this before, this is probably not the best device because it doesn't have SNMP, but let's go discover a device. Well, I use that Geist. I like that Geist watchdog. So in this environment, right, in order to ensure that we can communicate with this device, you need to make sure that SNMP is enabled like we talked about before. Once it is enabled under the device's SNMP tab, this is where you can start to add details about it. You can add pre-configured sensors for devices that we have the MIBs associated with that. Okay, if you have a system that's out there that you know has OIDs that you want to see within SNMP, and if we don't discover the MIBs automatically, then by all means, you should email support@domotz.com with the MIBs for that device. So that way, when you do things like typing temperature, we'll automatically pull out the OIDs for those devices, and then you can add those right into the system. In this case, and I showed you this before, but we can go in and then look at temperature over time, and we can set alerts on these things. Speaking of alerts, right, one of the ways in which Domotz gets utilized after we've discovered all these devices, after we've set up all these systems, is by enabling alerts. We're not going to go into details of shared alerts in the 101. That is for the 201. But in order to get you started, we want you to understand personal alerts. These are alerts that will go as a push notification to the mobile app, or will come to you as an email to the account that you're signed in on. So here I'm assigned in on jbfowler@gmail.com. Therefore, I'm going to get alerts, any alerts that I set up as an email alert to that account. The reason I like to show the personal alerts is because this is where you have real visibility into all the different types of alerts. Because I am looking at a device on the network, we're going to talk about the device alerts first, and then we'll go into network-based alerts. For any alert, it's really easy to understand this, but we can get alerts when a device goes down, meaning that it has missed a certain number of ICMP requests, right, or pings to that system over a period of time. For wireless devices, it is usually set to 10 minutes. For wired devices, it's usually set to 2 minutes, but you can change these default windows. If you have a device that you want to set so that it just checks it every 5 minutes, you can do that here as well. So this is how often the device checks for it being up or down, or the status of that system. If I were to configure an email alert such that when this device goes offline, right, it would wait for the default of 2 minutes or 5 minutes, whatever I change it to, and then send me a notification. If that alert comes back, or excuse me, if the device comes back online, we can set up alerts. We can look for alerts with IP address changes. So if that system, for some reason, changed its IP address, which could be a sign of spoofing, or it could just be that it lost its DHCP reservation, we can get alerts on that. As previously mentioned, let's talk about SNMP sensors first. We can set alerts for any of the SNMP OIDs and the variables. We can look for ranges of values. We can look for exact values. We can look for values going above a certain value or below a certain value. You can set alerts on those. I do want to mention TCP services. While this is a little bit more of an advanced topic, it's probably fairly easy to understand. Since this device has a web page associated with it, if that web page ever falls offline, I can set an alert for that, meaning if that TCP service stopped. You can utilize this on Windows machines or Linux machines for RDP, right? You can look for port 3389. You can look for Telnet, SSH ports, things of that nature, and set alerts on those. Even if you have custom ports that you know should be running or have services available, you can trigger on that too. And then lastly, for each device, I can set alerts on their network performance. Essentially, we're looking at latency of that system as being a performance metric. If that latency goes above a particular threshold or above a certain average latency value, or if you're receiving a percentage of packet loss above that threshold that you set, you can trigger an alert. So these are the types of device alerts that you can set up. Let's go look at some network-based alerts. So when I'm under my agent's dashboard, I can go to the alert settings. And here you can see at the top, I can go to network, or by the way, I can go to each device that's on the network and start adding alerts there. But under the network alerts, and again, we're looking at personal, we can look at things like when the agent loses connection to the cloud. This could be because the ISP goes down, it could be because of a power outage, but if that agent is no longer communicating with the cloud, I can receive an alert. As we get into more security-like alerts, right, we can see that if a new device is discovered on a network, for most networks, right, if you're doing this on a guest network, it's probably going to overwhelm you. But if you're doing this on a secure network or a data LAN where there shouldn't be new devices being added to it all the time, you can get alerts on that. This is one of those things that for the CIS controls is extremely important, right? Understanding what's on your network, understanding which devices are authorized or not. This is a very valuable tool for that. Looking at which ports are open at the firewalls is another thing. So this is at the network level. So if we see ports, TCP ports being opened from the cloud back into the network, right? So service ports, then we want to, or we will alert you to that. If you see devices on the network taking advantage of UPnP, which most service providers probably disable UPnP because it's fairly legacy, but if you are seeing ports being opened from a UPnP host, we're going to alert you to that. So that way you are aware of it. And you can either deal with it, right, shut it down, or you can accept it as appropriate. If ever there's a public IP address change, okay, so if you're using a redundant WAN setup, right, so you've got two ISPs maybe and you've got failover, if you happen to have one of the ISPs go down and indeed that router fails over or that firewall fails over, we're going to give you an alert to that IP address changing. And of course, if there's any configurations within the LAN itself, right, from the network switches that change, or if the DHCP server or DNS server or whatever changes, right, we're going to alert you to that as well. And while we didn't talk about it in great detail, I'll let you know that Domotz is continuously pinging or monitoring the speed of your ISP. So we're doing standard speed tests. We do this once every 6 hours. You can disable this for those of you that may be shocked by that and want to disable it. You absolutely can disable it. But if we see the performance of the ISP changing, you can set alerts on that as well. I'm on a cable modem here, so that's why I get this large variability within the system. Another thing that I'll tell you within this network speed test or network performance area, this is where you can get a lot of information about what your ISP is, right? Any information about the interfaces that are associated at that level. If you want to start doing some route tracing or route analysis to see how things are performing, you can do that. You can go to specific services that we've allowed, or you can put in your custom as appropriate. And then of course, you can get information on when the system goes up or down on this page. So again, you can generate alerts on those just as easily. I think that's enough at this point about alerts, okay? The idea here is to be able to show you in this 101 training that you can set these alerts. If you want more information about the personal alerts and configuring those, you can go to help.domotz.com. We're going to talk more about shared alerts and how you can integrate those alerts into ticketing systems or into your messaging platforms like Slack or Teams in the 201 webinar. At this point, I will say that when an alert occurs, the next thing you want to do is remotely connect into that system to see how you can address it. Under the Remote Connections and VPN tab, we will highlight every single device that's on that network and the different ports that are available for management of these systems. If we just take this, this switch here, you'll see that we've discovered SSH, Telnet, and port 80. It's very easy for us to make a direct connection to this switch. So I'm sitting here in my office, we're creating a connection through the cloud, a secure connection through the cloud, and then we are opening up a URL that is unique to my laptop. And if I type in my passwords here, you should see that we create a direct connection right into that device's web page, at which point we can get in and configure that system as necessary. You can go in, change setup, change VLANs, do whatever it is that you would do for this particular switch. If you needed to go in and change administration capabilities, save off a new configuration file, change a configuration file, do a firmware update, you can do all of that directly through that device remotely. Now, it's very easy to make a remote connection into an individual device, but sometimes you need to get onto the network as a whole. You guys are very familiar with VPNs, but Domotz has the ability to turn the Domotz agent into a VPN host, and then you can create a tunnel. I won't go through the process since we're doing a live webinar here, but if I were to save this configuration file, I could then use my a service like OpenVPN or TunnelBlick is what I use since I'm on a Mac to create that secure connection through the Domotz cloud into that agent, at which point then I would have essentially my laptop directly connected to that network. So now I can look at all the devices that are on that network holistically. And if I needed to use, let's say, a third-party tool to configure systems, or I wanted to go in and do firmware updates to multiple devices, I can do all of that directly on that network. I will say that these remote connections are by design. They last only 1 hour. Of course, you can make a secondary connection, but if you're doing something where you have transfers that take a long time over the network, just be aware that you have about an hour, so judge your time accordingly. One other thing that I will mention about these remote connections. So let's look at devices. So here, if I type something like SurgeX, which is a PDU or a power distribution unit, Domotz will recognize the outlets that are associated with these PDUs so you can power cycle them. You can associate these network connected devices, or even if you have devices that are not network connected, you can create dummy devices, and then you can tie those devices to these outlets. The beauty of that is, let's just look at this EA5 secondary here, is that I could power cycle it here or reboot it, but one thing I can also do is if I were to just go into the device itself, EA5 secondary, right? We will notice that I can, from that devices page, directly power cycle this as well. All right, so this is just a really neat capability here. Okay, so essentially, we covered what we needed to cover. You guys will notice that I primarily talked about the Sites Explorer page because this is the first page that you come into. It's the nice, easy to use screen. When it comes to the inventory page, this is where you can see all of the devices across all of the networks that you are dealing with. Here you'll notice that I have 2,300 devices that I can look across. From a sites perspective, I've got about 13 sites. And then you can even, and this is a new feature that we just created, we can start to organize our sites by their names. Okay, and we can associate sites within organizations or within companies. So if you're dealing with customers that have multiple sites, or you're dealing with franchises that may have multiple networks, you can associate each one of the sites within those organizations, which just makes it easier for you to understand the multi-tenancy aspect here. I am in the 201, we'll go into utilizing the inventory page for managing all of your systems effectively. And then we'll also talk about the monitoring dashboards, how you can use this to set up specific device, specific systems, and associate those in a way that makes sense to you. The other thing that I'll say in the 201, we're going to finish up with some reporting and logging basics. We'll talk a little bit more about network diagnostics and performance, but also the network security tab and how you can utilize that. And then we'll dive into much more detail about setting up device sensors, advanced alerting, using the shared alerts, which I mentioned, which that's probably the most powerful way in which you're going to utilize Domotz, especially for proactive monitoring. And then the last thing we'll talk about in the 201 is setting up some external services. So things like Meraki, cloud-based services. A lot of you probably use Ubiquity and Unify. We could talk about that. And then also documentation services that are associated with your company, right? And how we can bring data from Domotz into those documentation tools. With that being said, Giancarlo, I do want to ask you what type of questions we ended up getting and what we should cover. Is there anything that you think that I missed that I should have talked about?
Hi, GB. No, you did a great presentation. Of course, you know, there is always a constraint with the time because the things that we always usually want to show during this demo are a lot. But we will cover some of them with the 201. In particular, a couple of things that are going to be noticed next week or in few weeks are new improvements in the inventory tab, new improvements in the monitoring dashboard, a lot of work there. But also in terms of integration, we are adding more and more scripts to integrate with software, hardware, like the MySQL server, which are going to be announced probably tomorrow. Yeah, it's probably tomorrow. But there will be more like Redis servers or HTTP servers like Nginx or Apache 2 and a lot of this kind of software, but also hardware, as I was mentioning. We have been receiving some questions as well. We have addressed most of them live and answered. I see an interesting one just came from Mike, and it's related to the remote connection. So the question is about remote connection and the encryption certificate and how we manage that. So first of all, worth to mention that we have a page which explain in details how we do perform the security, how we do manage the security within Domotz, and in particular how we use and leverage that for the remote connection. Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. It's probably in the website.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
Our security standard. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, this page is great, right? Security standards.
Security standard, yeah. And this is a white paper for the how we use security standard. There is also another guide about how the remote connection are created in Domotz and even compared to other tools that perform similar things. And I will ask my colleagues to provide that link as well. Yeah, this is I believe GB we had the specific white paper for that, but I might be wrong.
We have a couple different white papers on security and connectivity, and as well as leveraging the cloud and why it's important. So
yes, correct. So just to answer directly, Mike, we do inject a certificate which is created on the fly directly into the agent side, in the agent, say the agent host, and that will create the secure connection based on SSH, reverse SSH to our cloud, and then from our cloud to the client, we leverage the certificate for every single, let's say, we call them tentacle hosts. So when we create a remote connection, so there will be a two encryption layer there. What it is not encrypted, of course, is the connection local to the network, so between the agent and the end device, unless you're using an encrypted protocol. So for instance, if you're doing the remote connection to SSH, that's of course encrypted also locally to the network. But if you're doing remote connection to an HTTP service local on the network between the agent and the HTTP service, the connection of course is not encrypted, but it's exactly the same as if you were sitting in the local network and connecting to the HTTP server, basically. So I hope that it's clear. I believe Mike is still online, so if he wants to add any comment, he's welcome, and we will address any further question. Apart from that one, GB, you covered most of the things. Worth to mention, the capability of Domotz are really, I mean, I usually say that Domotz has been built for scalability purposes. So yes, through the inventory, you can search a lot of devices all together. Through the Site Explorer, you can navigate fast into the device. But the most important thing is that all the things that you see in the UI are available also in our public API. So if you're willing to do massive updates, if you're willing to build your own web GUI, or if you're willing to integrate Domotz in your own system, we do allow every single user to use our API, Open API, to integrate with their systems, with their UI, with their scripts, and reporting capabilities is
actually, Giancarlo, yeah, one of the things, we usually cover the APIs in the 201, but it's always good because people ask about this. So if you go to portal.domotz.com/developers, you guys can gain access to all the APIs that we build our application around. I want to point out two things because there was a question that came in as well around, looking at PCs and servers and what we see, because I mentioned this, right? We can get more information if we have access into these systems, right, through the OS monitoring or what we call driver management tables. But within the system, we can see things like the operating system details, the memory and the physical disks. We can actually see if there are virtual machines running, and we can grab a lot of information about the virtual machines. But one other thing, and you talking about the APIs, I wanted to point this out. Within our APIs, you can actually go in and get a list of all the applications that are
Correct.
currently running within that machine as well. So this is just kind of the start of what we're doing with respect to more details about PCs and servers that are running in your network. The idea is how can we look at which systems are consuming resources within the network. And so there's some very, very powerful tools here that I think Domotz has. A little bit more advanced, right, beyond the 101 training, but you should definitely be aware, and I appreciate somebody asking the question about device details of the operating systems.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, JB. That's perfectly the right way of positioning it. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, Giancarlo, thank you very much for addressing that. I want to thank the team for addressing a lot of the questions that came in to our system, the GoToWebinar here. And we look forward to seeing y'all on the 201 webinar in 2 weeks. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope y'all have a great day.
Thanks, guys.